This playlist collects together and organizes the individual component modules, which together comprise our third and final lecture, covering the materials from our reading Scientific Treatments of Physical Domains. Recall that this chapter focuses upon the development of a scientific treatment of a particular physical domain from early proto-scientific or folk understandings of the phenomenon associated with the domain through a series of incremental steps until it reaches something like a mature science or a normal science. In our first two lectures, we focused primarily on this first step. In the first lecture, we talked about concepts and categorizations. In the second lecture, we focused on ontological frameworks. In this lecture, we'll briefly recapitulate the salient points about ontological frameworks before moving on to discuss the other steps in this progression. We'll move on to discuss how it is that theorists identify potential domains of rational inquiry, how features of inquiry come together when we have the emergence of a paradigmatic case, a rigorous and largely correct treatment of a particular set of phenomenon within a specified domain, how scientists and theoreticians then work to elaborate upon that initial paradigmatic case, creating a paradigm around it, how that paradigm then serves to structure the initial scientific domain, and how that domain is further articulated or altered as scientists continue to develop that paradigm. Maybe they discover other paradigmatic cases that help to further articulate and clarify the nature of the domain and the relationships within it. Let's go ahead and shift our focus now to that recapitulation of the salient points we discussed with regard to ontological frameworks. Remember, we said that ontological frameworks are essentially frameworks of categories and relationships between these categories, and that this framework serves to structure the way that thinkers break up a domain and think about the potential relationships between elements of those domains. We said that these categories specify the kinds of entities, properties, relationships, and dynamical changes that can occur or that are thought to occur within a particular set of phenomena. So, for instance, when we think about fundamental kind categories, we talked about things like forces in physics, the living, non-living distinction, the mental, non-mental distinction. All of these are fundamental kind categories in their respective sciences. We also talked about fundamental property categories. So, for instance, we said that mass is a fundamental property had by all physical objects. We said that atomic number was another fundamental property that specifies the exact number of protons in the nucleus for any particular element in the elemental table. Similarly, consciousness presumably is a property that's had by some, but not all, living creatures. In addition to specifying kind classes and property classes, we also have relations and dynamical changes that are thought to occur between these categories of entities and properties. So an example of a relationship that is common in biology is the notion of a taxa, the relationship between different phylums within biology. This is a relation that is not a dynamical evolution of a system, but a relationship between categories that forms a hierarchy within the ontological framework. Isochronism is an example of a relation. It is a dynamical change, but it's a dispositional dynamical change. It's a regularity in the way in which pendulums were thought to move in Galileo's time. An example of a full-on dynamical relationship that might be captured within an ontological framework would be something like the ideal gas law that relates the changes in the pressure of a gas and the temperature of a gas, for instance. In addition to these categories and relations, we mentioned several other important properties of ontological frameworks. For example, we noted that ontological frameworks are most prominent in early inquiry, particularly in proto-science, and then also in times of crisis within a scientific establishment. We said also that there are often multiple candidate frameworks during early inquiry and during crisis, when ontological frameworks are vying for adherence, are trying to find traction amidst either a lack of scientific treatment of a domain or a crisis in a scientific treatment of a domain. We noted that ontological frameworks tend to lack systematicity and rigor. The concepts of an ontological framework, initially at least, tend to not be very well defined. The relationships tend to be fairly loose, and they also tend to have a tenuous connection to the phenomenon within that domain, so that it is difficult to see when they are correctly and incorrectly applied to phenomena. In our next lecture module, we'll turn our attention to how theorists start to constrain phenomenon into a well-defined domain, and then begin to investigate that phenomenon by the development of, for example, an experimental tradition.